Napoleon Bonaparte once shook the world with cannon fire. But there was one man who made Napoleon tremble with nothing but silence. He did not hold a sword. He held a secret file. Welcome to the anatomy of power of the most terrifying political monster in French history, Joseph Fouché. Forget the Minister of Police at his peak. Look at the chaos that made him. The year is 1793. Paris was not the city of lights. It was a slaughterhouse. The French Revolution had shifted from romance to the terror. The executioner's blade never stopped in the Place de la Révolution, and the atmosphere of demise drove people mad. In this insane context where human life became more fragile than ever, Joseph Fouché appeared, not as a loud warrior, but as a pale ghost. Before the blood, Fouché was a man of God. He was originally a cleric who taught mathematics and physics. This detail is crucial. While others saw souls, Fouché saw statistics. Politics wasn't a debate, it was a if the equation required a zero crossed out, he erased a man. No pulse, just profit. The first event, marking the turning point, transforming the gentle cleric into a monster, took place on January 16, 1793. That was the day the National Convention voted on the fate of King Louis XVI. The day before, Fouché was still a moderate. He had prepared an eloquent speech calling for clemency for the king. He believed taking a life was unnecessary, but when he entered the hall, when he saw the Parisian crowds screaming for the king's head from the galleries, and when he felt the heat of the frenzy, Fouché did the math instantly. He realized that compassion at this moment meant his own demise. Cruelty meant survival. When it was his turn to step up to the podium, Fouché did not pull out the speech for mercy. He crumbled it in his pocket. He threw it away. He coldly uttered the word that killed a king and saved a monster. Death. That was the moment Fouché unlocked his greatest weapon, the lack of a conscience. He understood that to hold power, or simply to survive, principle was a luxury item he was not allowed to possess. He betrayed his faith, betrayed his faction in a split second to jump to the winning side. The execution of Louis XVI was not just the end of the monarchy, but the coming-of-age ceremony for Joseph Fouché. But if he stopped at voting with the crowd, Fouché would be just a mediocre opportunist like many others. What made him particularly terrifying was what happened next in the city of Lyon. The convention unleashed Fouché on the city of Lyon to crush a royalist uprising. Here, he conducted a brutal experiment in power based on fear. Other revolutionaries took lives out of hatred, out of hot fanaticism. Fouché did not. He acted with the coldness of an administrative machine. He found the guillotine too slow. Efficiency was his god, and individual executions were a waste of time. He ordered hundreds of prisoners tied in clusters, then used cannons to fire directly at them. Those still breathing after the cannon volley were finished off immediately by soldiers. Thousands were ruthlessly processed under his command. The Rhine River turned a deep crimson. He even organized blasphemous ceremonies, dressing donkeys in bishops' robes and dragging crosses through the streets to mock the old religion. Do not mistake Fouché for being bloodthirsty. No, he suppressed the people of Lyon so brutally, not because of hatred, but for a much scarier calculation. He needed a shield made of casualties to blind Robespierre in Paris. He knew that in the capital, Robespierre was watching every move. Fouché needed to prove he was the most extreme, most decisive revolutionary, so no one would dare question his loyalty. Power here is built on the principle. Becomes so terrifying that no one dares to touch you. In letters sent back to Paris, boasting of his achievements, Fouché wrote lines that were chillingly cold. He described the purge as a necessary social hygiene process. Not a shred of emotion, not a shred of regret. It was the rise of a type of emotionless technocratic power. However, this excessive brutality was also a double-edged sword. When Fouché returned to Paris, he realized the atmosphere had changed again. Robespierre, the dictator of the revolution, began to feel disgusted by Fouché's excessive actions. Robespierre considered himself the embodiment of virtue, and he saw Fouché as a stain. It was a war of gods and monsters. Robespierre wanted a heaven on earth purely made of blood. Fouché just wanted to survive. The prophet versus the parasite. This was the most dangerous time in Fouché's life. Robespierre was at the height of his power, calling himself the supreme being. He publicly attacked Fouché, calling him an imposter. Every door in Paris closed to Fouché. Everyone thought he was a dead man walking, but this is where Fouché's genius shined. Instead of fleeing, he played the role of a pathetic victim. He stopped sleeping at home, moving from house to house in the shadows, making himself look weak and harmless. But behind that facade, the spider was weaving its web. Fouché smelled danger, but he also smelled the fear in others. He knew Robespierre was preparing a new purge list, and the name Joseph Fouché was certainly on the first line. He used this to his advantage. He met every delegate in the convention, people who were trembling before Robespierre. He whispered into their ears calculated lies. "Your name is on the list. I saw it. Today it is me, but tomorrow it will be you." He sowed panic, linking anxious men together with a common threat. He turned their cowardice into a weapon. Fouché did not stand up to make speeches. He did not appear publicly. He only moved like a phantom in the dark, connecting Robespierre's enemies. And then, the fateful day of 9th Thermidor arrived. Robespierre was overthrown, severely wounded in the face, and dragged to the scaffold. The dictator fell. But few knew that the true architect of that coup was the man lurking in the dark corner, Joseph Fouché. Ending the revolutionary phase, Fouché had proven his superior survival skills. He had been heavy-handed in Lyon but overthrew the brutal Robespierre. He had betrayed the king, betrayed God, and finally betrayed the revolutionary leader. He walked out of the ashes of the revolution with a dark past, but his head was still on his neck. And more importantly, he had learned the most expensive lesson. In the Game of Thrones, the winner is not the strongest or the most moral. The winner is the one who holds information and knows how to turn the fear of others into his weapon. Fouché was no longer a provincial cleric. He had completely transformed. He was a lone old wolf, belonging to no pack. He was ready for a new era, an era where a young military genius named Napoleon Bonaparte was about to step onto the stage. A dangerous combination was about to form. On one side was the conquering sword. On the other was the brain of the shadows. Will the sword cut the shadow? Or will the shadow swallow the sword? France was drowning in blood. The revolution had gone mad. People didn't want freedom anymore. They wanted bread. And from the smoke of the battlefield emerged the answer. Napoleon Bonaparte, he was the sort of France had been waiting for. Young, invincible, and glorious. But a sword, no matter how sharp, cannot rule a country on its own. It needs eyes to see in the dark. It needs a hand to silence the whispers. Napoleon conquered the land, but he needed someone to conquer the minds. And so, the alliance between the hero and the monster began. When Napoleon seized power, he appointed Joseph Fouché as the Minister of Police. A naive observer might think this job was simply about arresting thieves or patrolling streets. But Fouché had a different vision. He did not build a police force. He built a nervous system that covered the entire nation. Fouché's philosophy was simple, yet terrifying. If 3 people meet to talk, one of them works for me. He constructed a pyramid of surveillance that the world had never seen before. At the bottom were the ordinary informants, market vendors, carriage drivers, servants in noble houses, and even beggars on the street corner. They listened to the mood of the city. Above them were the professional spies, agents who infiltrated secret societies, royalist plots, and Jacobin clubs. And at the very top, sitting in a dimly lit office on the Quai Voltaire, was Fouché, the spider in the center of the web. Every morning, Napoleon received a special document called the Daily Bulletin. It was a report compiled by Fouché, detailing everything that happened in Paris the day before. Who met who criticized the first consul, what were the prices of bread, what was the latest gossip in the salons. Napoleon became addicted to these bulletins. He felt like he held the heartbeat of France in his hands. But what Napoleon often forgot was that the author of that bulletin was Fouché. Fouché decided what Napoleon saw, and more importantly, what Napoleon did not see. By controlling the flow of information, Fouché was subtly controlling the ruler himself. The relationship between these two men is one of the most fascinating psychological studies in history. It was a toxic marriage of necessity. Napoleon hated Fouché. Ekadedi Mahidia's face, a born traitor, and a man with the soul of a snake. Napoleon knew about the massacres in Lyon. He knew Fouché had betrayed every master he ever served, but he could not fire him. Why? Because Fouché knew where all the bodies were buried. The power of Fouché in this era was not based on guns, but on the file. He kept a dossier on everyone, every general, every politician, every diplomat, and even the Bonaparte family itself. Fouché knew about their debts, their affairs, their secret vices. This was the birth of modern blackmail. He didn't need to arrest his enemies. He just needed to let them know that he knew. That silence was heavier than any chain. The audacity didn't stop there. He didn't just spy on the emperor. He bought his wife. The Empress of France had a weakness. She spent money she didn't have, and Fouché owned her debt. Fouché, with his unlimited secret funds, quietly paid off her creditors. In exchange, the Empress became an informant for the Minister of Police. He didn't just spy on the emperor's bedroom. He bought the woman, sleeping in it. Fouché knew what Napoleon whispered on his pillow before the sun even rose. He had successfully privatized the privacy of the most powerful man in Europe, but the true test of Fouché's value, and the moment he proved he was smarter than Napoleon, came with the plot of the Rue Saint-Nicaise in 1801 evening. As Napoleon was on his way to the opera, a massive bomb exploded near his carriage. It was a devastating attack. Dozens of bystanders were killed or injured. Buildings collapsed, but Napoleon miraculously survived. In the aftermath, Napoleon was furious. His rage blinded him. He immediately blamed his old enemies, the Jacobin, the extreme left. He demanded Fouché arrest and execute the Jacobin leaders immediately. He shouted at Fouché, "This is your old party. You are protecting them." Fouché remained calm. His face was a mask of stone. He told Napoleon, "No, citizen consul. This is not the work of Jacobin. This technique smells of the royalists." Napoleon laughed in his face. He ridiculed the minister in front of the entire court, calling him a Jacobin sympathizer and insisting on purging the left wing. Fouché did not argue. He simply went back to work. While Napoleon was busy exiling innocent Jacobin, Fouché utilized his machine. He traced the remains of the horse that pulled the bomb cart. He found the seller of the cart. He found the cooper who made the barrel for the gunpowder. Piece by piece, like a master detective, he reconstructed the crime. And he was right. The perpetrators were Schwann's fanatical royalists funded by the British. When Fouché presented the undeniable proof to Napoleon, the room went silent. Fouché had not only solved the crime, he had humiliated the ruler. He proved that without his cold logic, Napoleon's hot temper would lead to disaster. Napoleon had to admit he was wrong. It was a victory for Fouché, but it was a dangerous victory. Rulers do not like to be reminded that they are dependent on their servants. From that moment, Napoleon promised himself that one day he would destroy Fouché. As the years passed and Napoleon crowned himself emperor, the empire reached its zenith. France controlled Europe. The need for internal spies seemed to diminish. Napoleon felt secure enough to finally get rid of the man he loathed. In 1802, he dissolved the Ministry of Police and sent Fouché into retirement. He thought he was freeing himself from the shadow. But Fouché did not leave quietly. Before vacating his office, he did something that defines his character. He burned half of the archives and stole the other half. When the new officials arrived, they found empty cabinets. The files weren't in the drawers. They were in Fouché's head, and he took them home. And here lies the irony of power. Wielded Fouché. The police force became blind. Plots began to sprout like weeds. Conspiracies multiplied. Napoleon, the master of the battlefield, found himself lost in the fog of domestic politics. He realized, with bitter resentment, that he was vulnerable. In 1804, swallowing his pride, Napoleon had to re-establish the Ministry of Police and call Fouché back. Fouché returned, not with gratitude, but with a smirk. He had proven a fundamental law of power, indispensability. He made himself part of the structure of the state. To remove him was to remove the foundation. But the Fouché who returned was different. He was now the Duke of Otranto, a wealthy noble, a man of immense stature, and he began to look beyond Napoleon. He saw the emperor's ambition growing like a cancer. He saw the endless wars draining France. Fouché smelled the blood in the water. He didn't need numbers to see the truth. Napoleon was a sinking ship, and rats always know when to leave. Fouché decided that he would not fall with the emperor. The architect of shadows began to draw a new blueprint. It was no longer about serving Napoleon. It was about preparing for the post-Napoleon world. He started secret correspondence with the British, with the royalists, with the very enemies Napoleon was fighting. He was running a foreign policy of his own, right under the emperor's nose. The stage is set for the ultimate betrayal. The master has become a liability to the servant. The shadow is preparing to detach itself from the object that casts it. How does a spy bring down an emperor? And what happens when the man who knows everyone's secrets decides to sell the biggest secret of all? The year is 1812. The grand army of Napoleon is drowning in the snows of Russia. 500,000 men marched in. Only a few thousand ragged ghosts walked out. To the world, Napoleon was still the emperor. But to Joseph Fouché, Napoleon was already a dead man walking. Napoleon was falling, and Fouché never bets on a falling star. When Napoleon returned from the disaster in Russia, he needed loyalty more than ever. But Fouché did not offer loyalty. He offered doubts. He began to subtly undermine the emperor's confidence. He whispered to the ministers that Napoleon had lost his touch. He wrote secret letters to the British, testing the waters for a peace treaty. Napoleon, sensing the treachery, fired Fouché again. But it was too late. The seed of betrayal had been planted in the heart of Paris. In 1814, under the pressure of the Allied armies, Napoleon abdicated and was exiled. The Bourbon kings returned to the throne. Fouché, the man who voted for the death of the king's brother 20 years ago, should have been executed, but he was not. Why? Because he made himself the bridge. He convinced the royalists that only he could control the radical mobs. He survived the transition, but he was sidelined. The king did not trust the regicide, but history has a sense of humor, and Fouché has the patience of a spider. In March 1815, the impossible happened. Napoleon escaped from exile. He landed in France with a handful of soldiers. The king sent armies to stop him, but the soldiers dropped their guns and cried, "Long live the emperor!" Napoleon marched toward Paris without firing a single shot. The king fled in terror. The government collapsed. Paris was empty. Who was left standing in the vacuum of power? Joseph Fouché. This moment, known as the 100 Days, is the pinnacle of Fouché's career. It was a masterclass in duplicity. Napoleon arrived in Paris, desperate. He had the army, but he had no government. Paris was holding its breath. The tricolor flags flew, but there was no joy, just a suffocating dread. 500,000 foreign soldiers were marching towards the border. In this hysteria, Napoleon realized his marshals could fight battles, but only one man could fight the whispers. He summoned Fouché to the Tuileries palace. Imagine the scene. The emperor and the traitor, face to face. The air in the room was thick with tension. Napoleon, pacing back and forth like a caged tiger, stopped and slammed his hand on the table. He pointed a finger at Fouché, his voice trembling with rage. "Fouché, I know you betrayed me. I know you are whispering to my enemies. I should have you executed for treason right here." Fouché did not flinch. He stood perfectly still, his face a mask of stone. He waited for the emperor to finish shouting, then replied in a quiet, icy tone, "Sire, I do not think that would be of service to your majesty, right now." Napoleon swallowed his pride. He looked at Fouché and saw his own political death staring back at him. With a feeling of physical revulsion, he gave Fouché the job. So began the most bizarre game of chess in history. By day, Fouché served Napoleon. He organized the police, suppressed the royalists, and raised funds for the army. But by night, Fouché was the head of the resistance. He whispered assurances to the Austrians. "Wait, be patient. This is just a temporary madness." He was actively betting against his own emperor. The game could not last forever. Fate rolled the dice, and the result was Waterloo. On June 18th, the cannons roared in Belgium. Napoleon was defeated. The dream ended in mud and carnage. Napoleon rushed back to Paris, hoping to raise a new mass conscription to save the country. He wanted to be a dictator, to fight the invaders. But he found the gates of power locked, and the man holding the key was Fouché. While Napoleon was fighting on the battlefield, Fouché had taken control of the parliament. He spread fear among the deputies. He stood before the assembly, his voice low but penetrating. He did not shout. He simply stated the terrifying reality. "Gentlemen, the emperor has lost. The allies are marching on Paris. They do not want France. They want the man. If Napoleon stays, they will burn this city to the ground. We must sacrifice the individual to save the nation." When Napoleon arrived at the Elysee Palace, exhausted and covered in dust, he found himself isolated. He planned to dissolve the parliament, but Fouché had already outmaneuvered him. The parliament, under Fouché's influence, threatened to depose the emperor if he did not abdicate voluntarily. The game was over. On June 22nd, Napoleon signed his second abdication. The eagle had fallen. And who caught the crown as it fell? Joseph Fouché. For a brief moment in history, this former priest, this executioner of Lyon, was the head of state of France. And what did he do with that power? He sold it. Fouché knew the Allies wanted the king back, so he prepared to welcome Louis XVIII. But he had a price. He wanted a guarantee of his own safety and position. He arranged a meeting with the king's representatives. Then came the moment that made the blood of royalists run cold. The door to the king's chamber opened. The room froze. Look closer at that moment. Talleyrand, the club-footed diplomat, could barely walk. He needed support. And Fouché, the cold calculator, offered his arm. They walked slowly, step by painful step, past the rows of horrified dukes and duchesses. Two old men, two traitors, united by their survival instinct. They were the architects of the new France, walking over the corpse of the old one. It was, as history recalls, Silently Vice entered, leaning on the arm of crime. The man who voted for the death of the king's brother was now helping the king back to the throne. Fouché had successfully brokered the transition. He betrayed Napoleon to save France, and then sold France to save himself. On Julio 8, the King Louis entered Paris, and in his first list of ministers, signed by his own hand, was the name Joseph Fouché, Minister of Police. It was the ultimate transaction. The king hated him, the people feared him. But for one moment, everyone needed the devil to hold the door open. He was the only one who knew where the keys were. He was the only one who could keep the secrets buried. Fouché had won. He had survived every giant. He outlived the terror, the directorate, the empire. But he forgot the first rule of architecture. Once the house is rebuilt, you don't keep the dirty scaffolding, you tear it down, and you burn it. Joseph Fouché, executioner of the revolution, spymaster of the empire, kingmaker of the restoration. He has outlived every enemy. He has betrayed every friend. He sits now at the right hand of King Louis XVIII, holding the portfolio of the Minister of Police. He believes he has won the ultimate game. He believes that by selling Napoleon, he has bought his own safety forever. But Fouché, the master calculator, made one fatal error in his equation. He calculated the interests of men, but he forgot to calculate their pride. The royalists, the very people Fouché helped return to power, despised him. To them, he was not a savior. He was a necessary evil. He was the man who voted for the death of the king's brother. He was a red. Every time he walked into the Tuileries palace, the noble ladies would turn their backs. The Duchess of Angoulême, the daughter of the executed Louis XVI, refused to enter any room where Fouché was present. The air around him was freezing, but the king still had one last use for the dirty scaffolding. France was plunging into the White Terror. The ultra-royalists were screaming for revenge against anyone who had supported Napoleon during the 100 Days. The king needed a butcher to sanitize the kingdom, but he needed his own royal hands to stay clean. He needed Fouché, and so, on July 24, 1815, Fouché performed his final act of service. He sat at his desk to compile the infamous proscription list. This moment represents the absolute depths of Fouché's moral abyss. To keep his job, he had to write down the names of his own former comrades. He did not tremble. The pen moved across the paper with cold precision. He wrote down the names of generals, politicians, and friends. Among them was Marshal Ney, the bravest of the brave, the man who had fought alongside Fouché for the glory of France. The execution of Marshal Ney was not just a death, it was a national trauma. On a grey December morning, near the Luxembourg Gardens, Ney stood before the firing squad. He refused the blindfold. He placed his hand over his heart and shouted to the soldiers. Soldiers, straight to the heart. The volley fired. The hero fell. The hero fell. But the invisible bullet came from the pen of Joseph Fouché. By signing that list, Fouché thought he was proving his loyalty. He thought he was buying insurance. But he was wrong. As soon as the ink was dry, as soon as the blood of Ney was spilled, the king's need for Fouché evaporated. The dirty work was done. The scavenger was no longer welcome at the feast. The royal court looked at Fouché with disgust. His rival Talleyrand, watching the downfall, summarized the situation with a cynical smile. He repeated the old saying of Voltaire, applying it perfectly to Fouché: the king has squeezed the lemon. Now, he must throw away the peel. In September 1815, under immense pressure, the king dismissed Fouché. But it was a polite dismissal. He was appointed as the ambassador to Dresden. It was a disguised exile. Fouché packed his bags, leaving the Ministry of Police for the last time. He walked out of the shadows of Paris, thinking he would return. He did not know that he was leaving France forever. The moment he crossed the border, the trap snapped shut. In January 1816, the French government passed a new law banning all regicides from the country. Fouché was stripped of his title, his position, and his citizenship. The man who once held the secrets of all of France was now a stateless person, a ghost wandering across Europe. The final years of Joseph Fouché are a study in pathetic loneliness. He became a toxic asset. He went to Prague, but the authorities treated him like a plague carrier. They remembered his massacres in Lyon. The local nobility shunned him. Nobody wanted to be seen talking to the monster. Eventually, he settled in Linz, Austria, and here, history offers us one last fascinating interaction. The only man who tolerated Fouché was Prince Metternich, the Chancellor of Austria. Metternich was a mirror image of Fouché: cold, calculating, ruthless. He kept Fouché close, not out of friendship, but out of curiosity. He wanted to study the specimen. Imagine the conversations between these two Machiavellian giants in the cold Austrian winter. One was the master of the old world, the other was the survivor of the new one. But even Metternich eventually grew bored of the old man. Fouché spent his days walking by the Danube River, an old man in a grey coat, ignored by the passers. For a man who fed on secrets, silence was torture. No more daily bulletins, no more spice, no more whispers. Just the wind, rattling the windows of a cold house. He wrote desperate letters to the king, begging to be allowed to return to France. He wrote, "I am not a traitor. I serve the state. I saved the monarchy." The only answer he received was silence. The lemon peel had been thrown into the dirt, and no one cared to pick it up. In Lyon, Fouché moved to Trieste, a port city in Italy. The winter there was harsh. The wind from the sea chilled his old bones. He knew the end was coming. In these final days, Fouché did something that reveals his ultimate fear. He began to burn his papers. 4 days, the fireplace in his room roared with flames. This was not just a cleanup. It was the erasure of a lifetime. Into the fire went the secrets of the revolution. Into the fire went the scandalous letters of Josephine. Into the fire went the lists of spies, the evidence of bribes, the blueprints of conspiracies. He watched the ink turn to ash. He was burning the only thing he ever truly loved. Information? Why? Was he protecting the people in those files? No. He was trying to rewrite history. He wanted to destroy the evidence of the monster so that posterity might remember him as a statesman. But he failed. The great biographer Stefan Zweig later wrote that Fouché was the most exceptional political genius of his time. But he was a genius without character, a man who sacrificed everything for power, only to lose it all. On December 26, 1820, Joseph Fouché died. There was no state funeral, no cannons fired, no weeping crowds. Just a simple service in a foreign land. The man who had sent thousands to their deaths, who had toppled emperors and kings, died in his bed, not with a bang, but with a whimper. Ordinary, forgotten. Silence was the only tribute to the man who once controlled every whisper in France. So, what is the true cost of such survival? Joseph Fouché represents a very specific type of power. The power of survival. At any price. He was not a leader, like Napoleon, who inspired men to die for him. He was not a traditional monarch who ruled by divine right. Fouché was the first modern bureaucrat. He proved that in times of chaos, the man with no convictions is the man who wins. While the heroes died for their beliefs, Robespierre for virtue, the royalists for the king, the soldiers for glory, Fouché lived because he believed in nothing but himself. He was the political animal in its purest, most ruthless form. He showed us that information is a weapon more potent than a sword, and that silence can be louder than a cannon. But look at the cost. Idiot alone, despised by all. A man without a country, without a friend, without a soul. He attained absolute power, but he lost his humanity in the process. The sword of Napoleon is broken, but his legend lives on in glory. The shadow of Fouché remains, but it is a cold, dark stain on history. He teaches us that it is possible to survive everything, only to end up with nothing. The file is closed. The sum is 0.